Hello, everyone, and welcome to our roundtable. Today, we're discussing the future of California higher education under President Donald Trump's second term. I'm Amy DePiro, a higher education reporter at EdSource.
And I'm Michael Burke, also a higher education reporter at EdSource. EdSource would not be able to bring these roundtables monthly if it weren't for the support of our founders. So a big thank you to the College Futures Foundation, Lumina Foundation, and Kresge Foundation for making today's roundtable possible.
It's no secret that now is a turbulent time for higher education. The Trump administration has abruptly canceled billions in federal research grants and taken aim at diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. It has terminated and then moved to restore thousands of international students' visas. Colleges and universities, in addition, face a multitude of federal investigations. And that's to say nothing of current federal budget proposals, which sketch dramatic changes to financial aid. In short, we have a lot of ground to cover. I would like to welcome today's panelists. Cristian Ulises Reyes is a master's candidate in higher education counseling and student affairs at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. Gregory A. Smith is the chancellor of the San Diego Community College District. Gina Ann Garcia is a professor in the School of Education at UC Berkeley. And finally, Dominique J. Baker is an associate professor of education and public policy at the University of Delaware.
We'll start with Dominique. Dominique, could you help summarize basically the way the federal government stance has changed, especially toward colleges, universities, and their students under the second Trump administration?
Oh, sure. Yeah. We'll start this off real easy, really short and concise answer. So thank you all so much for having us out to have a rich conversation. I would say that broad strokes, when we think about the current administration, the word that I would say is antagonistic, to put it kindly, with higher education. So what this means is that the federal government is taking a role, and I think it's important not to just think about the executive branch, but to also think about our legislative branch, the Supreme Court, sort of the entirety of our federal apparatus, taking a sort of antagonistic approach with higher education, which means things like incursions into things like what schools can teach, how they can treat their students, the spaces that students are allowed to feel safe in. It also includes the potential concerns around things like financial aid and how students are able to actually finance going to college. Basically anything you can think about when it comes to colleges and universities, different missions from community colleges to research intensive to open access public four-year institutions, the different roles, responsibilities that they all have. Every one of them is being, I guess, attacked is the nicest way I could put it by the federal government. When you sort of have push around what might be considered an authoritarian takeover of a country, one of the number one places that research shows that come under attack are actually colleges and universities. And that is because they are often centers of resistance to that. Just for no reason, I figure I mentioned that.
Thanks, Dominique. And there's a lot to follow up on there, but I wanted to turn to Greg. Greg, you're obviously the chancellor of one of the largest community college districts in California, and there's a lot of concern just among college stakeholders in general about federal funding and whether it's at risk. So I'm wondering, could you tell us about the federal funding that your district already receives and whether that could change or already might be changing under this administration?
Yeah, so our district receives about $64 million in federal funds every year. The largest chunk of that, over 43 million, is financial aid for students. A large majority of that is our Pell Grants. We have about $20 million in programmatic funding. And so to several of the points that Dominique made, the concern now is that the administration is looking at higher education through the lens of a lot of rhetoric we've heard over the last decade about higher education being a place of indoctrination of certain political beliefs or social ideals. Higher education is not as valuable as it once was, that what's being taught or the types of programs that we're running are not aligned with industry need or with conservative values in particular. And so a lot of the concern around our programmatic funds that we're receiving to support specific communities of students in specific areas. So we know broadly across higher education in America that fewer Black students, fewer Hispanic or Latino students are enrolling in STEM programs, succeeding in those STEM programs. And so we have specific funds to address those issues. And we're very concerned that those funds are going to go away. And we're seeing remarkable success rates in those programs. And so the concern now is how do we continue to do the work if the federal government is no longer supporting it? What state resources are available? How can we use our general ongoing funding within our colleges to continue that work?
Do you have an example of one of those types of programs? And have you, not to make you repeat yourself, but have you kind of thought about what the immediate solutions might be if you do lose funding?
We have. I got some very good advice from one of our retired political science professors last fall, very early in the fall, in August actually, to start planning for what will happen and looking at Project 2025 and the chapter on Department of Education, assume some of these things begin. So a specific example would be our HSI STEM grants, Title III grants from Department of Education. Our district receives about $3.5 million a year to fund those activities. And as I mentioned, we're seeing remarkable success rates, dramatic increases in enrollment, persistence, and success, particularly for our Hispanic students in STEM fields. So we look at it in the short term. With the staffing reductions at Department of Education, the people to actually process the funds coming to us gets delayed. How do we continue the program in delays in funding? That the administration decides we're not going to fund this, and now we end up in a legal battle over, does the administration have the power to do that, given that Congress authorized these programs and these funds? And that might be a longer term process, and it will cost us some money. And then probably the most catastrophic version is Congress actually amends Title III of the Higher Education Act and eliminates the program in its entirety. And so each of those presents scenarios where we look at other funding sources we could draw on in the short term, bridging to, could we get a state HSI program designated, for example, with funding, or what other funding sources do we have available to be able to continue that in the long term? It may need to look different, it may be funded differently, but we're certainly committed to continuing the work in any of those three scenarios.
Thanks, Greg. And then when it comes to the four-year universities and specifically, Gina, the University of California, is there anything you can tell us in terms of kind of what you've seen so far? Again, as far as the impacts of potential federal funding losses for the UC?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we're a massive system, so there's a lot of different things going on. But I think we are definitely sort of preparing for the worst, right? While knowing that this is having tremendous impact on a university that the master plan of California designates the University of California as the research arm, right, of the three systems, right? So we, of course, are heavily impacted by the loss of research dollars, which is where there's been a lot of freezing of funding. But to Greg's point, as far as like Pell Grant students, like that's where we're going to be hit the most, right? If this changes and financial aid goes through, we are going to see a dramatic loss of low-income students. Like the access to higher education is going to be detrimental. And what's going to happen is we're going to see of the three systems in California, the University of California is the most elite, and we will continue to enroll people that have the means, right? We're going to lose students that don't have the financial means, and many of them are like go into first or immediately into the California community colleges, right? That's why our California community colleges match the state of California's graduating population. We have 56% of our graduating population is now Latina identified. That's what the community college system looks like, because that's the access point. So if we lose federal funding, like that's going to be, what that comes by way of financial aid, that's going to be the most detrimental, right? And so I think we all know that that's even worse than the freezing of research dollars. Although the freezing of research dollars, we're losing important research, right? Like medical research, environmental research that like saves lives is now being taken away, is freezing, right? So that's what we're dealing with, right? As far as what our mission is as the University of California.
And Gina, real quickly, can you help clarify for our audience in case they're not fully up to speed? What exactly is happening right now with the Pell Grant, and how is it at risk?
Well, I would love for Dominique to come in because I feel like she could definitely break it down even more. But I mean, the changes that are being proposed are basically going to make it really hard for people to get financial aid. They're going to be basically eliminating most loans, right? So like graduate student loans are being eliminated, parent loans, which help, students, and it's going to be much harder. Probably one of the most dramatic changes would be the increase to 15 units for Pell Grant students, that they'd have to be enrolled 15 units. Like that is detrimental to part-time students, right? And a lot of our students that enter, particularly in community college systems, are part-time students. So I think there are different pieces of it. But yeah, I would definitely tag in Dominique for any of your thoughts on it, because this is coming down right now, the most current proposes.
Yeah, and like this is part of why I appreciate and understand why people talk a lot about like the current administration and talk about like the president and the executive branch, but all the stuff we're about to talk about is coming out of Congress. So that's why like we have to be thinking from a broader perspective about like the federal government's role in higher ed right now, because basically what Gina's talking about is there are a suite of proposals that would fundamentally change lots of parts of financial aid. So there are things that would make it a bit trickier, a bit harder for people to get access to Pell Grants, particularly the full amount of a Pell Grant. There are also things that would make it more difficult to get access to the amount of money that people typically use for their student loans. And combining with that would make it a lot more difficult for people to get into the repayment plans that can help them sort of reduce the amount that they owe per month so that it more directly is tied to how much money they earn per month, right? So that these are programs that are tied to sort of how much money does a person earn in a year. Okay, we can sort of figure out how much they could realistically pay back on a student loan. These changes would make it much harder for people to be able to gain access to those types of programs, would make it more challenging for people to be able to get forgiveness, to sort of wipe out the balance of their loan after a certain point as well. So it's really good. I think like the key takeaway I have is not good in a value sense. But I think that a good summary of this is that it makes it more difficult for low-income students to gain access to higher education overall. And that is through grants, through student loans, through repayment, like all those different pieces. Like the sum of this is that we would expect that if all of these policies went into place the way that they are currently written out, we would expect to see a stark drop in low-income students enrolling in higher education, whether that's for the first time or students who had already previously enrolled leaving higher education before they earn any sort of credential or degree.
Thank you. I want to bring Christian into this conversation, right? As somebody who is currently a student, was very recently an undergraduate. How are you thinking about federal financial aid? I'm wondering if there's, advice that you might give to students who are trying to figure out how their aid packages might be impacted, or perhaps are even weighing whether to apply for federal aid depending upon their situation.
Yeah, so I'm a student who's been a beneficiary of programs like the federal Pell Grant. And among like not only myself, but also my peers, I've felt a shift of fear and uncertainty especially for a lot of the populations that we've listed, like low-income students, like first-generation students. The administration's attacks on student protections feel personal for many of us. You know, students aren't just numbers in policy debates. We're the ones that are being directly impacted. And moving more on to financial aid programs made college possible for me. It made college possible for people in my community to go on and break these generational barriers, break what was supposed to not be in the path for us. You know, because of the federal financial aid, we were able to finance a future for ourselves. And we're making those generational changes. And it's scary to hear that all of those programs could be cut or even restricted. And I think specifically for like our undocumented and our mixed status communities, those are also experiencing a ton of fear. And I know applying for financial aid is scary, but it's also completely worth it. I know there's a lot of community resources that are leading that work, that are connecting with students who may not necessarily find those resources in their high school or on campus. So I encourage you all students who are here listening today to connect with those community resources, to get involved and find out how you can maximize the financial aid that's being given to ensure that you're able to go to college and you're able to finance your way to receive that degree.
And some important points that you've raised there. And of course, in California, there is also the California Dream Act application, which some students can take advantage of for state aid. I want to pivot just a little bit while staying on the subject of federal funding. Another dimension that we're seeing play out are occasions where the Trump administration has used federal funding as a point of leverage when it's wanting to influence, university policies. And we're seeing universities react differently to that pressure. Columbia University, for example, ultimately agreed to some concessions, while Harvard has opted to sue the administration, has taken a stronger stance to fight back. And I'll turn back to Dominique for kind of a national perspective. Are there lessons that you think California universities can learn from those experiences?
Oh, definitely. So I think it's really important to also keep in mind when we talk about Columbia and Harvard, which are a good sort of thing we can think of as different ends of the spectrum. I will just highlight that I'll talk about some other types of institutions after I do a quick thing on them. So the general piece, right, is that the administration is interested in sort of threatening institutions to say, we want you to do X, Y, and Z, and if you don't, we will cut you off from funding. They do that to Columbia, and Columbia folds real hard, very fast. What's interesting, and so I will mention it, is they do that to Harvard, and Harvard begins having conversations with them about what they might need to do in order to appease the federal government. And then the administration accidentally sends Harvard a demand letter that they had not planned to send at that time, allegedly. And in that's where they start escalating the asks that they have for the institution. So they start off sort of saying, we want more proof that the institution is committed to things like fighting anti-Semitism, which is a worthwhile cause to fight anti-Semitism. If only the current administration was actually interested in that would be something that is worthwhile. Does not seem to be something that they actually care about. But that was the start of the demands that then quickly shifted to, by the time Harvard got an escalating letter, they were things like the administration wanted to tell Harvard the exact types of faculty members to hire. It wanted to tell Harvard what types of majors they were allowed to have, the different types of departments they were allowed to have. It wanted to be able to control certain parts of different departments. And so that is ultimately when Harvard decided to push back. And I think there are a ton of lessons in there that, number one, capitulating right out of the gate, like Columbia did, is not helpful because the administration came back weeks later asking for even more. So capitulating just lets them know that you're willing to give them what they want, which then means that the administration can come back with even more outrageous asks. And Harvard is also a good example because it means that their board, for a bit of time, was going to try to negotiate with the administration around things that large swaths of their staff, their faculty, and their students would say impinge on things like academic freedom, human rights, et cetera, et cetera. And so Harvard chose to sort of go along with this until the asks got to be so high that they felt they could no longer engage in conversation. A big lesson for institutions across California, that is public, that is private, that is community colleges, all the way across the master plan's grand ideas for higher education in California, is that negotiating with the government and expecting the federal government and expecting it to be a good faith negotiation is sort of a fool's errand. That if the federal government says you do this and we swear we won't investigate you, you cannot believe or trust that that would actually be the case. The federal government seems at this time to be very comfortable with making a request, and if you acquiesce to it, they will just make another request over and over again. So you would actually be better off doing things like institutions in the Big Ten, for example, having their faculty senates come together in order to vote to say that they will have an alliance, a compact to sort of have each other's back. So when the federal government comes to try to attack one, the other institutions will come in to have support and to be able to have some sort of solidarity work across higher education. And so even more than like the Harvard role, I would push institutions to be thinking about that sort of like Big Ten compact alliance, where we think about what does solidarity look like across higher education institutions in a way that instead of thinking about competing against different institutions for resources, students, things like that, we think about the role and the power that higher education has across these different organizations.
Thank you for that wonderful overview. And, I think, it's not just Ivy League institutions that are finding themselves being mentioned in Department of Education press releases these days. There are a number of University of California campuses, California State University campuses, at least one California Community College that I'm aware of, who have been, I guess it's been announced that they're under investigation by the federal government, sometimes related to violations under Title or alleged potential violations under Title VI, but some other things as well. And so I wanted to turn back to Gina. I guess I'm interested in your observations about how UC has responded to heightened federal scrutiny so far. Like, what's the approach that it seems to be taking? Does that seem promising to you?
Mm-hmm. Yes. I think the interesting thing with California is that we have been an anti-affirmative action state for 30 years. So we're a hard state to come for, because a lot of these are they're wrapping it up in the most recent Harvard case, right? The Students for Fair Admissions Act, not Act, what's the third A, whatever, SFAA case versus Harvard, that's what they're kind of using as like, oh, you're violating this most recent ruling, which basically eliminated affirmative action. Well, we're talking about a state that's been anti-affirmative action for 30 years, right? So we've had 30 years to get in compliance, right? So we're not really the state you want to come for if they're smart, which is why I think we all kind of expected, of course, they would come for the University of California and are, but like not in dramatic ways as I think like we're seeing, like we saw with Harvard and we saw with Columbia. Because legally, we've spent a lot of time figuring out what that looks like to not consider race in hiring, race in admissions, while still being equity minded. I keep saying how to be race conscious without being race conscious, right? But like that's the reality of our state is we can be equity minded because of the people that are here, right? We are a very diverse state. We're a very diverse enrolling state. Every single public system is a minority serving institution. Every single one of them, all of the California Community College, all of the Cal States, and all of the UCs, right? We are all at that point. So I think that's the interesting thing about being here is like we've had a little bit of time to figure it out. So that was a lot of the early sort of grumblings of like, okay, we've been through this, right? Like we've been through this. We can get through this. I know for our campus, we continue to keep our heels down. We feel very supported by our administration to say we are not going to cancel things like cultural graduations. I attended a cultural graduation 2 days ago, right? And basically we have a Q&A, a list of Q&As, questions to help answer those FAQs, right? And one of them is like, everything must be open to everybody. Like that's the key thing. So now you're seeing on a lot of websites and in invitations and in emails, you are invited to XYZ, everybody is welcome, right? Like you literally have to insert that. So all these websites, all these invitations, emails are going out and says everybody is welcome. And basically that's like what we're being told is like that covers it, right? Now the reality is everybody's always been welcome. There's never been exclusion into a cultural celebration or to a cultural center or into a EOP program or whatever it may be, right? Like this always, and so we know that, right? Now we're just inserting that and saying everybody is welcome. Who decides to enter into these different spaces is a different question, right? Of who actually decides that they want to be involved in these different things. So I think that's beneficial for us is that we have had some time to work through this. I'd love to hear, the community college perspective from Greg, like as far as our, is it the same thing? Because I feel like that's how we're handling it in the University of California is like, we definitely can get through this.
Yeah, absolutely, Gina. And you really hit the most important point that by virtue of Proposition 209, which barred race conscious virtually anything in education, the Fair Employment and Housing Act, so many protections in the education code, we have more strict non-discrimination requirements and more categories of protected classes than the federal government by far. And so everything we have done to align with state law has protected us. When the Dear Colleague letter came out on Valentine's Day saying that we're going to consider anything done under the heading of diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility to be immediately discriminatory, I really had no fear of that because I know everything we're doing is already compliant with state law. And you can't say that just because you put a certain label on it, it is by legal definition discriminatory. So we have not stopped any of those activities. We've not changed the name of any of those activities. To Gina's point, more than 70% of the students in the California community colleges, and this is true of our district, are from communities of color, LGBTQI+, immigrant, mixed documentation status. So we've been doing this work for a long time. We've been doing it within a legal framework, and nothing changed by virtue of an executive order telling executive branches how to go out and enforce the law. So it really has not affected us in terms of the programs. What it has affected is fear within the community and people wondering, is it safe for me to show up here? Concerns that individuals in the community might feel empowered to act out. We saw this in 2017, 2018, incidents of violence, of harassment within the community itself. No action of the federal government, but because of the rhetoric around it, people start to feel empowered to do this. So we've had to do a lot of work talking with people about what are the programs that we're doing? Why do we do those? Making sure that individuals understand that our civility policies, our academic freedom, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, like all of those remain fully intact. Our board has been very proactive in adopting resolutions, commitments to institutional protection from the government trying to weaponize funding or law enforcement in other areas against expressions and speech, protecting our faculty's ability to show up in the classroom and teach the class in the way that they've determined they're going to. And to some of what Dominique was saying earlier, I think this is really important in this moment that we say these are lines around which there is no negotiation. They are fundamental to higher education in America. They are at the core of a free democratic society. And so there is no negotiation. We can't give up any margin on it whatsoever at all without crumbling the entire foundation of our institutions. And so it is that important. As one of my colleagues in our system said, this is a hill to die on, so to speak. And we firmly believe that in our district.
Yeah, and I think that while all of these systems have taken like a firm but careful stance, it's a really smart decision, but I think students also deserve more transparency and more involvement in these conversations that have been happening. when students don't trust their institutions, it doesn't allow them to kind of fall into that sphere of getting involved with their campus about making those decisions. And when we're left out, a lot of those decisions are being made without us. And I think institutions shouldn't be making decisions about us without us. We shouldn't be letting the sphere of investigation dictate how we support our students. We should continue to include our students in those conversations as well.
So for folks who maybe in the audience are new to California or less familiar with the context here, I just want to highlight one of the things that our panelists are alluding to is Proposition 209. This goes back all the way to 1996. It effectively is a ban on affirmative action in public institutions, including universities. And I think on that note, I wanted to ask our three California, based panelists, are there other things about California that you think insulate the state from disruptions to federal higher education policy or funding streams, or things that make California particularly vulnerable to them? This could be something about its size, the structure of, there's this grand master plan and these three higher education segments. Just what other things might make California peculiar?
I'll jump in first on that. On the public education side, for K-12, for community colleges, Proposition 98, which protected public education funding, that the majority of property taxes, and there's a defined formula by which we're funded, different than the CSU and the UC system, where when there are problems on the state budget, you can't come after K-12 and community college funding to solve those problems. And so we're seeing that in this budget year, where Proposition 98 funds, there's actually an increase in funding and in revenues. On the non-Proposition 98 side of the budget, there's a $12 billion budget problem the governor has to solve. And unfortunately, the CSUs and UC systems are slated for a 3% budget cut. But what that means is when there's kind of turmoil in the federal government, and especially around how funding is going to come through Department of Education, or if they eliminate that wherever it's going to go, we are a lot more insulated from those effects. The bigger problem that we would have is if the administration weaponizes all of the funding coming back to California from the federal government in a way that would cause a much more significant budget problem. But for protecting higher education within the community colleges, we are relatively insulated in California. We don't rely primarily on tuition revenue. We have one of the lowest tuition rates, $46 a unit in any system in America. So it remains accessible. And while we have a lot of fear around the Pell Grant cuts, the possibility of risk sharing, increasing the number of students that need student loans to go to a community college, that'll be far less of an impact than it will be in states that rely a lot more on students paying tuition to go to community college and don't have that state commitment in their funding formula.
Yep, I can jump in. I think, yeah, California, we're in a unique place in that we have a lot of policies in place, right, that like are already protecting some of the things that are at risk nationally. Like, for example, equity is policy, right? And I mean, the California community colleges are required to submit equity plans, right, every single year that map out and that disaggregate data, right, to show where equity issues are. Like, equity is policy here. So as long as we remain a state committed to equity, I think we are protected in that sense. And so I think that's what worries me the most is as elections come up, we have a governor election coming up next year, right? And we have to worry about that. The governor appoints. I see a question in the Q&A about boards of trustees for the three public systems. The governor appoints, right, people to those systems. I know the university UC regents, right? Like, we have to worry about that, right? Like, who's going to be appointed if we had a change in governor, right? So I think the fact that we lean Democrats still is a protection, but I say still because that could change, right? That us remaining committed to voting in the people that we want to see in positions all across, right, at the local level too. At those local levels matter all the way up to the state level, that we need to remain committed. And I think California, we have a lot of communities that are very active, right? I live in the Bay Area. There's so many active communities of color that remain active and are remaining diligent, are saying, we don't care what you do, right? President 47, like, we are committed to what we're committed to, right? And are going to continue to fight, right? We have strong social movements at the ground, grassroots leadership. And I think that's going to be our protection. But we have to remain diligent. Like, we could swing in the next few years based on voting, right? Like, there are many of red districts in California. There are many, spots, big spots, and they're growing as far as leaning more Republican, which it changes what happens as far as funding and commitments to education when we change political leanings. So I think we're protected for now, but we need to remain diligent.
So I wanted to bring in a couple questions that we've gotten from the audience. We actually have two that are pretty similar, so I'm going to try to combine them. And whoever feels like answering this, feel free to jump in. But one question, one audience member said they have a daughter who is interested in majoring in environmental science with an emphasis in chemistry, but is wondering whether their daughter might consider changing their major or hold off entering university until the administration is gone. And then there's another audience, sort of a similar question, says they have a daughter who's planning to go to UC Davis to study atmospheric science, and another in high school who's interested in chemical engineering, and they're worried about federal funding for the sciences and how universities, might be able to ensure the sciences are funded. So I'm curious if anyone can just jump in, and maybe I guess the first question would be, should these students, consider delaying their education? And is there anything with the prospect of federal cuts that colleges or the state of California can do to make sure, the sciences and other programs are funded adequately?
I mean, I can jump in and say that our core functions are not funded by the federal government, right? So there's still going to be faculty, there's still going to be programs, there's still going to be universities and colleges, right? Like, our core functions are remain intact, right? And many of those are funded at a state level and through a variety of different sources, right? So the federal government, the big losses are to research dollars, right? So does that impact a student's experience? It does if they're part of the research enterprise, right? Some of those programs that come in, let's say from NSF, they fund programs that are like student support programs, right? So those kind of things are being impacted. So our core sort of functions will remain, but the things that are funded by the federal government, tend to be research dollars or programs like TRIO programs, right? Like there's threats to TRIO right now, right? TRIO is an important support source for a lot of students, and particularly low-income students and first-generation to college students. So those types of programs are going to be affected for sure, right? But we keep saying the threats to Pell Grants, the threats to financial aid are the biggest concerns as far as being able to fund education. A lot of people can't fund education if they don't have that additional support. But I guess as far as the question goes, our core functions will remain intact, I assume, I hope, right? I mean, I think we're probably going to see things like merging of programs, stuff like that we don't want to talk about, but that we're going to have to talk about if we get into dire situations. But the core functions will continue.
I'd come in behind that and agree and add, I think that it's important for anybody who is looking to get a higher education to start as soon as they possibly can. You can't get that time back. And I wouldn't be responsive to a generalized, non-specific fear by delaying education, just in case it might be a bad time. If something actually happens, you can always stop. But it's hard to start for a lot of people. And if you delay that, you might lose the ability to do that because your circumstances in life change. And Gina's point is really important. There is no change to what we're teaching in our chemistry classes right now. There is no anticipated change to that. I would add, I think an important part of this conversation is going to be private industry. San Diego has a very large biotech industry some nationally, internationally recognized, highly successful companies that rely on students coming through community colleges, transferring to San Diego State, UC San Diego, getting advanced degrees and going to work for them doing important research or engineering. There's going to be at some point, I think, some pushback from private industry saying we need people coming through these programs to continue to sustain our economy. And I think that's an important part of this, which ties back to the point that Dominique made earlier, that a lot of what's happening right now is going to restrict the people that have access to higher education and those high paying jobs, that career upward mobility, that socioeconomic mobility. And so what we're pushing back institutionally is making sure that that remains broadly accessible to people who aren't lucky enough to be born into wealth. But it should not stop anybody from continuing to participate.
Thanks, Greg. And I wanted to actually go back to Gina. I was hoping you could maybe clarify or help explain. You brought up TRIO programs. In case some people in our audience aren't familiar with those, could you explain what those are? And because I know they're quite prevalent across California.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, TRIO programs are part of the Higher Education Act of 1965, been around since 1965, and basically were started to support low-income students, right? Like TRIO is really what opened the door to higher education for low-income students, and has remained an important source for the last 60 years, really supporting low-income students. So TRIO includes programs like Upward Bound, student support services, what else? McNair Scholars, which is a early undergraduate research program, programs like that tend to support students at the entry point, right? Like an Upward Bound is a pre-college program, right? Like helping students, low-income students, even understand how to get into college, which is one reason why people don't go to college. They don't even know how to get into college, right? So TRIO has been there to support students, summer bridge programs, right? Helping them transition from high school to college. So these really vital programs that have basically been the reason for many people's success, right? Many, and particularly low-income students' success. But it's TRIO, threats to TRIO are on in that slew of policy or the bills that are coming down as far as like cutting funding to TRIO.
Got it. Thank you for explaining that, Gina. Another big concern right now is, well, let me rephrase that. International students in particular, I know, are pretty worried right now. There were a lot of international students across the country who had their F1 visas pretty abruptly withdrawn several weeks ago and then ultimately restored, at least temporarily. But I know just from speaking to college leaders in California that they're worried about international student enrollment declining just out of fear. So I'm curious, Dominique, what message would you have, or what, if anything, do you think California colleges and universities might do if they're worried about international student enrollment declining?
Yeah, I would say that if California institutions are interested in maintaining high international student enrollment, the number one thing they can do is to fight an authoritarian takeover of the U.S. government. And that's in part because we talk about the fear that international students have. It's not a paranoid fear, right? Like, we haven't explicitly said it here, so I'll say it. International students have been kidnapped off the street and moved to deplorable conditions while being detained. So it's a real fear for a real reason. If institutions are concerned both from like a humanity perspective, but also potentially from a revenue-driven perspective, given the fact that international students are not eligible for federal financial aid, which means that they pay full freight when they attend institutions. So wherever you fall along that spectrum, there are a number of reasons to want the rule of law to be respected within the United States, to want things like the sort of rights that we have outlined in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights for things around people knowing why they are being detained, people understanding and having clear information for why they have been arrested, those types of things. All of those are the types of moves that would need to be made to make international students feel safe. So a lot of that is not in the direct control of leaders at college and universities. There are some things they can do when it comes to helping connect their students with legal representation. When it comes to things, I'm actually helping to organize like a Know Your Rights training to help faculty members and staff to better understand how we make sure that we understand the law in a way that we can support and protect our students, our community members. But at its core, in addition to those things, if you care about international students, a number one thing you'd have to do is ensure that the United States is not kidnapping them.
And I know the vast majority of international students in California attend four-year universities, but there are also some that go to community colleges. Greg, does your district have a substantial number of international students? And the second part of that question, if so, would be, is there concern there in terms of, do you think fewer might enroll next year?
So I would not say a substantial number relative to our total enrollment. We have over 90,000 students. International students are a small percentage, but we do participate in the F1 visa program. To this point, we have not had any students have their F1 visa status revoked that I've been made aware of. We are checking weekly because colleges and universities are not being notified it's happening. We just log into the system and find out. But we're unique also in being a border city. And we recently had the state pass Assembly Bill 91, championed by Assemblymember David Alvarez, to allow us to serve low-income residents in Mexico within 45 miles of the US border and have them pay in-state tuition. And so they're not coming in on a visa program in the same way, but there is a lot of concern for the students that have started to enroll in that program, which just started this last year, that it is going to have an enrollment impact and students will not take advantage of that. And for a binational community like we have, we're a regional economy. That border is an artificial line between communities that are interconnected, products being made in the US traveling over to Mexico back and forth. So this starts to loop in some of the tariff conversation of, those products are being taxed multiple times now as they move back and forth, raising the cost of locally made goods for us. So there is a real concern about the longer term impact. As we sit here right now today, I've not seen any significant enrollment impact yet, though, I'm happy to say.
I think I'll transition us into what will probably be the last question of the panel. And I'll weave together one of the questions from the audience that we've gotten. In advance of this roundtable, we got a lot of questions. And if I had to summarize them, they were to the effect of, if we disagree with the direction that the Trump administration is going, what should we do? Somebody in the audience just now asked a question about, why haven't we seen large cross-sector coalitions, things that, combine education, government, business, reacting to policies. And then on the other hand, I'll say that, also in advance of this roundtable, we got some questions to the effect of, what are the opportunities for California to find common ground with the Trump administration? Are there ways that we can still benefit college students? Are there things that could be to their benefit? And so, I think, again, to kind of frame things nationally, I'll start with Dominique, but invite everybody to chime in with your perspectives.
Sure. Okay, let's go for it. I think a lot of this depends on sort of your job, your role, and also your comfort with what things you are open to doing when it comes to thinking about what individual people can do to either defend higher education if they would like to find ways for institutions to potentially align with directives from the administration. So I will say that, like, just as everyday people, right? One of the great things that Gina mentioned is that there are elections that are happening in California that play a substantial role in directing state policy. And often those elections are they have lower turnout. And so both just as an individual person voting, but also talking to people in your community about voting, about the issues that matter to you can be incredibly important. There's also the role that could be played for contacting and talking to members of Congress, as well as state legislators. So that's right, like state legislators are folks who are directing policy within California. Members of Congress representing California, right, are the ones who are helping to craft the federal policies that play a role. And so all of those things can matter. I will say some of the biggest things that people can do, I think, is to show up for their community in whatever way that can feel comfortable. As an example, one of the biggest things we've seen when some representatives of the federal government have attempted to, in some cases illegally, by force detain people, we've seen community members who will step in and say, like, what are you doing here? No, that is not something that you are allowed to do. And I will stand here in order to be beside this person that's in my community to say that, like, what you're doing is not legal. And so you can't do that. That's a really powerful thing for someone to do. And I think sometimes we think that standing with the people in our community is like really small and ineffectual. But actually that can play a substantial role in helping to protect members of the community, to help create more feelings of safety at a time when a lot of people feel incredibly unsafe.
Christiane, what are you noticing from the level of students?
Yeah, I think in a lot of these conversations, as mentioned, student voices are necessary, but a lot of the times the students, the ones who need the most help, are not able to voice their opinions. We worry about what dinner is for tonight. We worry about if we're going to have enough time to finish an assignment. We worry about the possibility of not seeing our family members because they've been detained. We worry about making sure that those who depend on us have all that they have to see another day. We worry about making sure that any free hour we have is spent making money to be able to pay for school. So I encourage all of my students to organize, to speak out, to vote. We've seen student testimonies shift policies and influence state leaders. Most recently, within the CSU level, we saw the governor revisit the budget where it was a 7.5% budget decrease. It was shifted to a 3%. So because students were out there voicing their opinions, voicing what impacts them and how it impacts them, we were able to make a change. But also recognize that in compromisation has limits. We can collaborate on logistics, but we can never at the cost of dignity, access, or inclusion. So keep going on out there and keep using your voice to make that change that you want to see.
Greg, I'm curious about your perspective from the community college as well.
First, I want to follow up something that Christian said I think is so important. I recognize in this moment, by virtue of my position and privilege, I can be a voice in spaces that students might not be allowed into or feel safe going into. And so I'm very, very appreciative of working in a district with a governing board that's committed to our work and allows and even expects me to show up that way. I think the thing about this question, looking at some of the questions that are coming in the Q&A about, are there reasonable questions being asked about the way higher education is funded, the way that institutions operate, administrator salaries, the cost of education? I think all of those are valid. There are valid questions to be asked, and we should be in a perpetual state of assessing how well are our institutions meeting the needs of our community, local industry, the workforce development, access to education. The challenge that we have right now is the way that it's being done is not by having a serious policy conversation about impacts. it's immediately going in with an agenda. And so the idea of why we've talked about authoritarianism is as soon as you say, if you don't teach this a certain way, we're going to take your funding from you. That's not a policy conversation, right? That's a threat. That is an attempt to exert control over the way that institutions operate, and most importantly, the academic freedom in the classroom. And we have, within the community colleges, we serve such diverse communities. We have people across the entire political spectrum teaching classes, participating in classes. And we do that within a framework that creates civility in how we do that, but allows for that type of academic exploration to happen. And so I think we can do a better job of telling people about how we do what we do, so that narratives around, well, what's really happening is this other thing, we can debunk that and show that's not who we are and what we're doing. And so the conversation just earlier about, should I be going into the sciences right now? It's really unfortunate that that's the conversation that we have to have. Like, nobody should be questioning the value of scientific research, trying to develop breakthroughs in medical care, in clean technologies that maintain our environment and our ability to enjoy it, and provide higher quality of life through the innovations that come out of it. So yes, I think we can do a better job of having those policy conversations, but we absolutely have to be committed to pushing back on the administration overreaching and trying to exert itself into controlling our institutions, how and what we teach, who we teach, fighting for our students to be able to continue to have access, educating people about, if you restrict the Pell Grant and the way that it's been proposed, community college students will be who you hit hardest. Students who are working, who are taking care of children, working parents that can't go to school full time, and you just took their Pell Grant away entirely. So did they take out a loan or did they stop? That is going to have severe consequences for the entire community, not for the short term, but for generations to come. And so we have to be out in front advocating in that way in our roles in order to make sure people understand these impacts, and we can have a more serious policy discussion.
Thank you, Greg. And I would be remiss if I didn't also loop in Gina again, again, responding to this question of, what can people do, but also is there common ground that you think could be sought?
Yeah. I mean, I agree with Greg. I think if it was a policy conversation, that'd be one thing. It's not that, right? It's like it's dramatic. It's overwhelming for people, right? To go through this sort of level of change. I think the idea of like, can we come to terms with this administration? Can we agree? I don't think we can. Like, if you look at the list of proposed budget cuts to education, every single program is basically being cut, except for one area, which is money to charter schools. Okay, one area, and that's wild, right? Because there's so much research about charter schools and, versus public schools, every area of education is being cut, right? The other thing to consider is that higher education, it took us 100 years to get to this level of reliance on the federal government, because the federal government hasn't always funded higher education. The federal government comes in really around World War II, it starts, but dramatically World War I, but dramatically in World War II, right? That's when the federal government starts funding scientific research for protection of the country, right? Why is there so much federal funding that goes into colleges and universities? Because colleges and universities is where the brilliant scientists are, and the brilliant scientists at that time were coming here, right? They were coming to the United States to do work and to basically come up with all kind of weapons of mass destructions, for example, right? Like created in a college and university setting, right? In a university setting, right? So the federal government had slowly came into this place where we came to rely on them so much, but it's dramatically cutting off in a way that it's like, it's going to take us 100 more years to get back to where, if they dramatically cut us off, it's going to take us 100 more years to get back to that point, right? Because this was slow over time. The first real form of financial aid is the GI Bill, right? Which is World War II GI Bill, where GIs were getting a dramatic amount of a good, significant amount of funding in order to go to college, right? That's our very first form of financial aid. And it wasn't for students of color at that time. It was primarily white GI, white men GIs that were getting that, right? So discriminatory from the beginning. And so all this progress we made was to not be discriminatory, to be able to get to a point where we actually were considering the demographics of the United States, right? And how the United States was going to support education, because if we don't support colleges and universities, what do we have, right? This is where we come up with new inventions. This is where people are trained for jobs. The number one issue that across the most recent SHEO, that's the State Higher Education Executive Officers, number one issue that SHEO executives are concerned about is jobs. Right? That like we need to create jobs. States are relying on colleges and universities to create jobs, and we're not doing it fast enough. In California, we're not doing it fast enough. So there's a lot of talk around that, right? And a lot of that is with the community colleges, like how do we create programs that are quicker, right? Quicker pathways to fill jobs that are needed, right? That's our role in colleges and universities, is to create the future workforce, right? For the state. And so without us having the support, it's going to take us a long time to get back to where we are at the moment if it's just dramatically cut off.
Well, thank you, Gina. That was we're running short on time here, and I feel like that was a good note to end it on. So we just want to thank all of our panelists and also the audience for joining us today, and thank you again to our funders, the College Futures Foundation, the Lumina Foundation, and Kresge Foundation, for the support that allows us to have these roundtables. Thank you so much, everyone.